Now, let me just jump now to more present stuff, and that is financialization and racial neoliberalism. Okay, so I want to turn to the restructuring capitalism or racial neoliberalism, which itself is a response to capitalism's crisis in the 70s. And I'm going to illustrate this shift to neoliberalization of racial capitalism through a story that I want to tell about Flint, Michigan. Okay? The story of Flint is a story of financialization, it's a story of security regimes, it's a story of the assault on democracy. And it's a story that many of us know, but I want to say a little bit more than what we probably know. So many of you know about, beginning about 4 years ago, the Flint water supply was poisoned. And you may know that in 2013, the governor of Michigan, Rick Snyder, appointed an emergency manager, a man named Darnell Early, to take over Flint's government in order to impose austerity measures to reduce the city's debt. By the way, the story I'm about to tell is very similar to Puerto Rico right now. You can see a lot of similarities. We could talk about that in Q&A if you want to. So to save money, Early decided to switch the public water supply from the Detroit River to the Flint River. The problem, the Flint River was polluted, everyone knew it, it was highly toxic. And to save money, the new regime, that is unelected regime, unelected emergency manager, stopped chemically treating the city's lead pipes, which made matters worse. So the results were that residents were getting sick, and that's what their water looked like. So residents continued to receive water bills for that water, okay? So of course they organized. So let's look at the larger picture to understand the neoliberalization of racial capitalism. First of all, over half of Flint's population is black, and they make up the largest proportion of residents living below the poverty line. And Flint is the second most impoverished city in the nation, next to Youngstown, Ohio. Secondly, black communities are especially subject to this kind of corporate state dictatorship, the idea of the emergency manager system, which imposes authoritarian governance in the name of austerity, okay? In Michigan, for example, 49% of the African-American population, at least 2 years ago, had no locally elected government and were under emergency managers. Black people make up about 14% of the state's population. In Detroit and Highland Park, by the way, my wife's late uncle was mayor of Highland Park for many years. The financial crisis was used to justify gutting public workers of their pensions and privatizing and raising the cost of water. So you have organizations like the Michigan Welfare Rights Organization and Blue Planet Project that went to New York, went to the United Nations to make the case that water is a human right. And they actually got support for this position. And that shutting off water to those who can't afford to pay their bills is a human rights violation. Okay, now, we know this part of the story. This part of the story we don't always know is, like, how come so many residents couldn't pay their bills? Or better, how did cities like Flint and Detroit, once having the highest paid workers in the country, thriving industrial workforce, become so poor and so unequal? Okay, and that's the story I want to tell a little bit about. So in 1960, Flint had one of the highest per capita incomes in the United States. General Motors was the main employer, and workers won strong wages and job protections because of intense union struggles. It wasn't a giveaway. And also the post-war growth of the US economy. During the 1970s, as manufacturing processes became more mobile, companies like GM, Ford left Michigan. Not entirely, but many of their manufacturing processes went for cheaper labor. They moved to the US South, they moved to Mexico. They opened up shop in South Africa, they've been there for a while, Brazil. And through free trade agreements, they paid even less in taxes and duties and set up shop in places with few environmental or labor regulations. So these shifts both produced and were responses to the global economic crisis of the 1970s, the global slump of 74 in particular, and also the oil embargo, the competition from automakers like Japan and Germany. In order to keep GM in Flint, because they didn't want GM to leave, the city government agreed to give the company huge tax cuts and promised immunity, and write this down for those of you who are going to write about it in your class, promised immunity from legal consequences for polluting the river, right? So, you know, you can pollute the river, we're not going to fine you, go ahead and do it, you know. And so the Flint River, that's how Flint River becomes massively polluted. So GM made billions of dollars in profits. And where did the money go? Did it go back into Flint? No, it went to the shareholders rather than the city. Because that's what capital does. They're not interested in the city. They're interested in shareholders. And accumulation and trying to do something with that surplus. But jobs still disappeared. And it disappeared through outsourcing, through reduced shifts, through automation. And so between 1979 and 2010, Flint still lost 87.5% of its manufacturing jobs. Okay, which is so interesting because, again, think about all the giveaways that the city and the state's giving them not to leave, and they're still losing jobs. So with GM, with their shares losing value, like many U.S. manufacturing firms, they turned to finance. Namely, GM entered the consumer finance market. They sold insurance packages, they went to banking services, and they sold mortgages, home equity loans to members of the public. And by 1999, GM was deeply involved in selling subprime mortgages to people who were unlikely to pay them back. And the result was predatory lending. Okay? Working people, overwhelmingly black working people, lost their homes as well as their jobs. And when the variable rate on the mortgages ballooned and the housing market collapsed, and that's what when we talk about the 2008 crisis, this had a domino effect on the economy. The domino effect left cities like Flint with really a fraction of the tax revenue. Because of course, tax revenue is generated by property taxes. And if people are not in your house and the property values decline, you're not generating much revenue. Okay? So what's worse is those tax breaks given to the very corporations that fleece the city, right? And ultimately, the city fell deeper into debt. Okay? And they couldn't get back the tax revenues from GM. So in order to try to come out of debt, what did they do? The city does what a lot of neoliberal cities do. They turn to privatizing public assets in order to attract investment capital. So public lands are sold off to developers. Water rates increase, and there's a push to privatize water. Downtown redevelopment schemes are encouraged using public funding, public debt, and substantial tax breaks, more tax breaks, to private firms to finance new buildings, skyscrapers, parking lots. And so the thing is, if they can't pay back that debt, then it's a loss. None of these ventures revitalized downtown. None of these ventures revitalized the economy. It left the city of Flint responsible for massive debt. And that massive debt became justification for moving the city council aside and putting an emergency manager in place to manage the debt. You see? Like Puerto Rico. So, continue our story very quickly. Back in 2014-15, when it was clear that the water wasn't fit for human or animal consumption, the city council tried to reverse the decision. The people opposed it, but the emergency manager refused. What we know now is that Darnell Earley was actually part of a plan, and that plan was to push Detroit into bankruptcy, to completely privatize the water supply. So what do I mean by that? So the Detroit Water and Sewage Department was operating with massive, huge budget deficits. So their bondholders were faced with potential loss of Flint as a customer. So they didn't want to lose Flint as a customer. So they placed greater pressure on delinquent customers to pay off, to pay their bill. So they'll cut off services to people, raise rates on Detroiters. And Detroit's water agency then offered to cut its rates in half to Flint residents. But Darnell Earley was like, no, don't cut the rates. So he had a chance to cut the rates, but then he said, we're going to continue to use Flint river supply. And then Jerry Ambrose, who replaced Darnell Earley, did the same thing. So instead, what they did was, and you could write this down, they signed an agreement with a private firm called Veolia to handle water management. So it's no coincidence that when Detroit's emergency manager, this is Detroit, Kevin Orr, was pushing to raise water rates and cutting off services to poor families behind in payments, he had begun negotiations with who? With Veolia. And in fact, it was under Orr's leadership that by 2014, the city had shut off water to over 150,000 residents who were behind in their bills, and began making plans to eliminate hundreds of jobs. So the shut-offs and the layoffs were really a strategy, as I suggested before, to make the Detroit Water and Sewage Department more attractive for private investors, like PREPA in Puerto Rico, which is the power grid. Obviously, there's a lot more to the story, and I'm not going to go much more into this, but we know that Darnell Earley's decision was pushing Detroit into bankruptcy and the complete privatization of water supply. What we see with Flint, therefore, are not only the consequences of neoliberalization of racial capitalism, which includes the dismantling of democracy, but we also see, and don't be mad at me for saying this, but the rise of a black political class that serves as junior partners in these forms of authoritarian governance, okay? So you got the blackface, right, of authoritarianism, all in the name of multiculturalism and diversity. See, diversity could jack you up, I'm telling you. You gotta be careful. So I want to close with some words on Trump, but I want to make a transition here. So the story of Flint, of course, is being replicated in Puerto Rico. It should remind us, I think, above all, that the authoritarian turn that we thought began in November 2016 was already in process. It didn't begin with Trump. We have at least 4 decades of globalization, neoliberal attacks on the welfare state, on public institutions, on the poor, covert wars, political and cultural backlash against movements for racial and gender justice, rampant xenophobia, open misogyny, attacks on reproductive rights, a backlash against diversity, multiculturalism, all that way before Trump was elected.